Chapter 20, Part 3 of My Life on the Plains. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. These Masita examined carefully, then, shattering them between two stones, the condition of the marrow seemed a point of particular importance to her as tending to determine the length of time the bones had been lying on the camp. After many minutes spent in this examination, during which I accompanied her, a silent but far from disinterested spectator, she, apparently like a judge who had been carefully reviewing all the evidence, gave me her conclusions, communicating with me through the medium of the sign language with a grace characteristic of the Indian race, and which added to the interest of her statements. Briefly summed up, her conclusions were as follows. 12 lodges had encamped at that point, probably constituting the band of some petty chief, the different members of which, like the ones whose trail we had that day discovered, had been separated for the purpose of hunting, but had been called together at that point preparatory to joining the main village. The lodges had left this camp not to exceed 2 weeks previous to that date, and in all probability had moved to the rendezvous appointed for the main tribe, which would without doubt be found by other small bands from time to time until the village would all be assembled at one point. Moving in this manner, and at this early season of the year, when the grass was scarce and no enemy known to be in the country, the Indians would make very short moves each day, passing merely from one stream to another, not accomplishing in one day a greater distance, probably, than the cavalry would in 2 or 3 hours. This intelligence, of course, was most gratifying, and for encouragement was soon communicated to the individual members of the command. The trail was found to lead almost in a northerly direction, slightly inclining to the east. Perhaps no one of the command experienced such a feeling of hope and anxious suspense as the new discoveries gave rise to in the breast of young Brewster, who now more than ever believed that, with reason too, that he was soon to unravel or forever seal the fate of his lost sister, whose discovery and release had been the governing impulses of his life for months past. With renewed interest, the cavalry resumed the pursuit at daylight the following morning. We had marched but a few miles before we reached a second camping ground, which had been occupied not only by those whose trail we were then following, but the number of fires showed that the strength of the Indians had been increased by about 25 lodges, thus verifying the correctness of the surmises advanced by Monacita. Continuing our progress, we had the satisfaction of seeing still further accessions to the trail, until it was evident that at least 100 lodges had united and passed in one body on the trail. As we marched in one day over the distance passed over in 3 by the Indians, and as the latter were moving unsuspicious of the presence of an enemy in that section of the country, the trail was becoming freshened as we advanced. That night we encamped with every precaution calculated to conceal our presence from the Indians. No fires were permitted until after dark, and then but small ones, for fear the quick and watchful eye of the Indian might detect the ascending columns of smoke. As soon as the men had prepared their suppers, the fires were put out. In the morning, breakfast was prepared before daylight, and the fires at once smothered by heaping damp earth over them. Resuming the pursuit as soon as it was sufficiently light to follow the trail, we soon arrived at the camp vacated by the Indians the previous day, the extent of which showed that from 300 to 400 lodges of Indians had occupied the ground. In many places the decayed embers of the lodge fires were still glowing, while the immense quantity of young cottonwood timber found cut and lying throughout the camp, stripped of its young bark, showed that the Indian ponies were being mainly subsisted on cottonwood bark, the spring grass not being sufficient to advance to answer that purpose. Nothing indicated that the Indians had departed in a precipitate manner, or that they had discovered our approach. It was reasonable, therefore, to suppose that we would come in contact with them that day, if not actually reach the village. All of our plans were made accordingly. The Osages, as usual, were kept in the advance, that their quick eyes might the sooner discover the Indians should they appear in our front. In order to avail myself of the earliest information, I, with Colonel Cook, accompanied the Osages. Two of the latter kept in advance of all, and as they neared the ridge or commanding piece of ground, they would cautiously approach the crest on foot and peer beyond, to ascertain whether an enemy was in sight before exposing our party to discovery. This proceeding, a customary one with the Indians, did not excite unusual attention upon the part of Colonel Cook or myself, until once we saw Hardrope, the head warrior, who was in advance, slowly ascend a slight eminence in our front, and after casting one glimpse beyond, descend the hill and return to us as rapidly as his pony could carry him. We almost anticipated his report, so confident was everyone in the command that we were going to overtake the village. In a few words, Hardrope informed us that less than a mile beyond the hill from which we had obtained a view, there was in plain sight a large herd of Indian ponies grazing, being herded and driven by a few Indian boys. As yet they had not seen us, but were liable to discover the column of troops further to the rear. To judge of the situation, I dismounted and, conducted by Hardrope, advanced to the crest of the hill in front and looked beyond. There I saw in plain sight a herd of ponies, numbering perhaps 200, and being driven in the opposite direction toward what seemed the valley of the stream, as I could see the tops of the forest trees which usually border the water courses. The ponies and their protectors soon disappeared from view, but whether they had discovered us yet or not I was unable to determine. Sending a messenger back as rapidly as his horse could carry him, I directed the troops to push to the front and to come prepared for action. I knew the village must be near at hand, probably in the vicinity of the trees seen in the distance. As the country was perfectly open, free from either ravines or timber capable of affording concealment to Indians, I took my orderly with me and galloped in advance in the direction taken by the Indians, leaving Colonel Cook to hasten and direct the troops as the latter should arrive. After advancing about halfway to the bluff overlooking the valley, I saw about half a dozen Indian heads peering over the crest, evidently watching my movements. This number was soon increased to upwards of 50. I was extremely anxious to satisfy myself as to the tribe whose village was evidently near at hand. There was but little doubt that it was the Cheyennes from whom we had been searching. If this should prove true, the two white girls whose discovery and release from captivity had been one of the objects of the expedition must be held prisoners in the village which we were approaching, and to effect their release unharmed then became my study. For I remembered the fate of the white woman and child held captive by a band of this same tribe in the Battle of the Washita. I knew that the first shot fired on either side would be the signal for the murder of the two white girls. While knowing the Cheyennes to be deserving of castigation, and feeling assured that they were almost in our power, I did not dare to imperil the lives of the two white captives by making an attack on the village, although never before or since have we seen so favorable an opportunity for administering well-merited punishment to one of the strongest and most troublesome of the hostile tribes. Desiring to establish a truce with the Indians before the troops should arrive, I began making signals inviting a conference. This was done by simply riding in a circle and occasionally advancing toward the Indians on the bluff in a zigzag manner. Immediately there appeared on the bluffs about 20 mounted Indians. From this group 3 advanced toward me at a gallop, soon followed by the others of the party. I cast my eyes behind me to see if the troops were near, but the head of the column was still a mile or more in the rear. My orderly was near me, and I could see Colonel Cook rapidly approaching about midway between the column and my position. Directing the orderly to remain stationary, I advanced toward the Indians a few paces, and as soon as they were sufficiently near, made signs to them to halt, and then for but one of their number to advance midway to meet me. This was assented to, and I advanced with my revolver in my left hand, while my right hand was left aloft, as a token that I was inclined to be friendly. The Indian met me as agreed upon, and in response to my offer exchanged friendly greetings and shook hands. From him I learned that the village of the entire Cheyenne tribe was located on the stream in front of us, and that Medicine Arrow, the head chief of the Cheyennes, was in the group of Indians then in view from where we stood. Little Robe, with his band numbering about 40 lodges, was a short distance further down the stream. I asked the Indian to send for Medicine Arrow, as I desired to talk with the head chief. Calling to one of his companions who had halted within hailing distance, the latter was directed to convey to Medicine Arrow my message to do, which he set off at a gallop. At this juncture I perceived that the Indians, to the number of 20 or more, had approached quite near, while some of the party seemed disposed to advance to where I was. To this I had decided objections, and so indicated to the Indian who was with me. He complied with my wishes and directed his companions to remain where they were. As a precaution of safety, I took good care to keep the person of the Indian between me and his friends. Medicine Arrow soon came galloping up, accompanied by a chief. While engaging in shaking hands with him and his companions and exchanging the usual salutation, "How?" with the new arrivals, I observed that the Indians who had been occupying a retired position had joined the group, and I found myself in the midst of about 20 chiefs and warriors. Medicine Arrow exhibited the most earnest desire to learn from me the number of troops following me. Whether this question was prompted by any contemplated act of treachery, in case my followers were few in number or not, I do not know. But if treachery was thought of, the idea was abandoned when I informed him that my followers numbered 1,500 men, the advance guard being in their sight. Medicine Arrow then informed me that his village was nearby, and that the women and children would be greatly excited and alarmed by the approach of so large a body of troops. To give assurances to them, he urged me to accompany him to his village in advance of the troops, and by my presence satisfy his people that no attack upon them would be made. This I consented to do. By this time Colonel Cook had again joined me, also Dr. Lippincott. Leaving the doctor with directions for the troops and taking Colonel Cook with me, I started with Medicine Arrow and a considerable party of his warriors to the village. Medicine Arrow urging us to put our horses to the gallop, the reader may regard this movement on my part as having been anything but prudent, and I will admit that viewed in the ordinary light that it might seem to partake somewhat of a foolhardy errand. But I can assure them that no one could be more thoroughly convinced of the treachery and bloodthirsty disposition of the Indian than I am, nor would I ever trust life in their hands except it was to their interest to preserve that life, for no class of beings acts so much from self-interest as the Indian, and on this occasion I knew before accepting the proposal of the chief to enter his village that he and every member of his band felt it would be to their greatest interest not only to protect me from harm, but treat me with every consideration, as the near approach of the troops and the formidable number of the latter would deter the Indians from any act of hostility, knowing as they did that in case of an outbreak of any kind it would be impossible for a great portion of the village, particularly the women and children, to escape. I considered all this before proceeding to the village. As we turned our horses' heads in the direction of the village, I caught sight of a familiar face in the group of Indians about me. It was that of Mawissa, the squaw whom I had sent as a peace commissioner from our camp near Fort Sill, and who failed to return. She recognized me at once and laughed when I uttered the word mutaka, referring to the hunting knife I had loaned her as she was about to depart on her errand of peace. A brisk gallop soon brought us to the village, which was located beneath the trees on the bank of a beautiful stream of clear running water. The name of the latter I found to be the Sweetwater. It is one of the tributaries of the Red River and is indicated on the map as crossing the 100th meridian, not far south of the Canadian River. Medicine Arrow hurried me to his lodge, which was located almost in the center of the village, the latter being the most extensive I had ever seen. As soon as I had entered the lodge, I was invited to a seat on one of the many buffalo robes spread on the ground about the inner circumference of the lodge. By Medicine Arrow's direction, the village crier, in a loud tone of voice, began calling the chiefs together in council. No delay occurred in their assembling. One by one they approached and entered the lodge until 15 of the leading chiefs had taken their seats in the circle within the lodge in the order of their rank. I was assigned the post of honor, being seated on the right of Medicine Arrow, while on my immediate right sat the medicine man of the tribe, an official scarcely second in influence to the head chief. The squaw of Medicine Arrow built a huge fire in the center of the lodge. As soon as all the chiefs had assembled, the ceremonies, which were different from any I had ever witnessed before or since, began. The chiefs sat in silence while the medicine man drew forth from a capacious buckskin tobacco pouch, profusely ornamented with beads and porcupine quills, a large red clay pipe with a stem about the size of an ordinary walking stick. From another buckskin pouch which hung at his girdle, he drew forth a handful of kinnikinick and placed it on a cloth spread on the ground before him. To this he added, in various amounts, dried leaves and herbs with which he seemed well supplied. After thoroughly mixing these ingredients, he proceeded with solemn ceremony to fill the pipe with the mixture, muttering at times certain incantations, by which no doubt it was intended to neutralize any power or proclivity for harm I may have been supposed to possess. To all this I was a silent but far from disinterested spectator. My interest perceptibly increased when the medicine man, who was sitting close to me, extended his left hand and grasped my right, pressing it strongly against his body over the region of his heart. At the same time, and with complete devoutness of manner, engaged in what seemed to me a petition of prayer to the Great Spirit, the other chiefs from time to time ejaculating in the most earnest manner their responses, the latter being made simultaneously. To the Indians it was a most solemn occasion, and scarcely less impressive to me, who could only judge of what was transpiring by catching an occasional word and by closely following their signs. After the conclusion of the address or prayer by the medicine man, the latter released my hand, which up to this time had been tightly grasped in his, and taking the long clay pipe in both hands, it likewise was apparently placed under an imaginary potent spell by a ceremony almost as long as that which I have just described. This being ended, the medicine man, first pointing slowly with the stem of the pipe to each of the 4 points of the compass, turned to me, and without even so much as saying, "Smoke, sir," placed the mouthpiece of the long stem in my mouth, still holding the bowl of the pipe in his hand. Again taking my right hand in his left, the favor of protecting influence of the Great Spirit was again invoked in the most earnest and solemn manner, the other chiefs joining at regular intervals with their responses. Finally, releasing my hand, the medicine man lighted a match and applied it to the pipe, made signs to me to smoke. A desire to conform as far as practicable to the wishes of the Indians, and a curiosity to study a new and interesting phase of an Indian character, prompted me to obey the direction of the medicine man, and accordingly I began puffing away with as great a degree of nonchalance as a man unaccustomed to smoking could well assume. Now, being, as I have just stated, one of the class which does not number smoking among its accomplishments, I took the first few whiffs with a degree of confidence which I felt justified in assuming, as I imagined the smoking portion of the ceremony was to be the same as usually observed among Indians so devoted to the practice, in which each individual takes the pipe, enjoys half a dozen whiffs, and passes it to his next neighbor on the left. That much I felt equal to, but when, after blowing away the first half dozen puffs of smoke from my face, the medicine man still retained his hold of the pipe with an evident desire that I should continue the enjoyment of this Indian luxury, I proceeded more deliberately, although no such rule of restraint seemed to govern the volubility of the medicine man, whose invocation and chants continued with unabated vigor and rapidity. When the first minute had added itself to 4 more, I still was expected to make a miniature volcano of myself, minus the ashes. I began to grow solicitous as to what might be the effect I was subjected to in this course of treatment. I pictured myself as the commander of an important expedition seated in a solemn council, with 1.5 score of dusky chieftains, the pipe of peace being passed, and before it had left the hands of the aforesaid commander, he became deathly sick, owing to the lack of familiarity with the noxious weed or its substitutes. I imagined the sudden termination of the council, the absurdity of the figure cut, and the contempt of the chiefs for one who must, under the circumstances, appear so deficient in manly accomplishments. These and 100 similar ideas flashed through my mind as I kept pulling vigorously at the pipe and wondering when this thing would terminate. Fortunately for my peace of body as well as mind, after a period which seemed to me to equal 1/4 of an hour at least, I felt relieved by the medicine man taking the pipe from my mouth and, after refilling it, handed it to the head chief, sitting on my left, who was drawing 3 or 4 long, silent whiffs, passed it to his next neighbor on his left, and in similar manner it made the circle of the chiefs until it finally returned to the medicine man, who, after taking a few final whiffs, laid it aside, much to my relief, as I feared the consequences of a repetition of my former effort. Romeo the interpreter, having been mounted upon an indifferent animal, had fallen to the rear of the column during the march that day, and I was deprived of his services during my interview with the chief. Colonel Cook during this time was in an adjoining lodge, each moment naturally becoming more solicitous, lest upon the arrival of the troops there should be a collision between the Indians and the excited volunteers. To the inquiries of the chiefs I explained the object of our march, without alluding to the 2 captive girls, the time not having arrived for discussing that subject. Having resolved to obtain the release of the captives, all other purposes were necessarily laid aside, and as I knew that the captives could not be released should hostilities once occur between the troops and Indians, I became for the time being an ardent advocate of peace measures, and informed the chiefs that such was my purpose at the time. I also requested them to inform me where I would find the most suitable camping ground in the vicinity of the village, to which request Medicine Arrow replied that he would accompany me in person and point out the desired ground. When this offer was made, I accepted it as a kindness, but when the chief conducted me to a campground separated from the village and from all view of the latter, I had reason to modify my opinion of his pretended kindness, particularly when it coupled with his subsequent conduct. My command soon came up and was conducted to the campground indicated by Medicine Arrow, the distance between the camp and the village not exceeding 3/4 of a mile. I was still uncertain as to whether there were any grounds to doubt that the 2 white girls were captives in Medicine Arrow's village. I anxiously awaited the arrival of Montecita, who could and would solve this question. She came with the main body of the troops, and I at once informed her whose village it was alongside of which we were located. To my inquiry as whether the 2 white girls were prisoners in Medicine Arrow's village, she promptly replied in the affirmative, and at the same time exhibited a desire to aid as far as possible in effecting their release. It was still early in the afternoon, and I did not deem it necessary or even advisable to proceed with undue haste in the negotiations by which I expected to bring about the release of the two captives. Although our camp, as already explained, was cut off from a view of the village, yet I had provided against either surprise or stratagem by posting some of my men on prominent points nearby, from which they obtained a full view of both our camp and the village, and thus rendered it impossible for any important movement to take place in the latter without being seen. I felt confident that as soon as it was dark the entire village would probably steal away and leave us in the lurch. But I proposed to make my demand for the surrender of the captives long before darkness should aid the Indians in eluding us. From 50 to 100 chiefs, warriors, and young men were assembled at my headquarters and about the campfire built in front of headquarters. Apparently, they were there from motives of mere curiosity, but later developments proved that they had another object in view. Finally, Medicine Arrow came to my camp accompanied by some of his head men, and, after shaking hands with apparent cordiality, stated that some of his young men, desirous of manifesting their friendships for us, would visit our camp in a few minutes and entertain us by a serenade. This idea was a novel one to me, and I awaited the arrival of the serenaders with no little curiosity. Before their arrival, however, my lookouts reported unusual commotion and activity in the Indian village. The herd of the latter had been called in, and officers sent by me to investigate this matter confirmed the report and added that everything indicated a contemplated flight on the part of the Indians. I began then to comprehend the object of the proposed serenade. It was to occupy our attention while the village could pack up and take flight. Pretending ignorance of what was transpiring in the village, I continued to converse through Romeo with the chiefs until the arrival of the Indian musicians. These, numbering about a dozen young men, were mounted on ponies which, like themselves, were ornamented in the highest degree according to Indian fashion. The musicians were feathered and painted in the most horrible as well as fantastic manner. Their instruments consisted of reeds, the sound from which more nearly resembled those of the fife than any other, although there was a total lack of harmony between the various pieces. As soon as the musicians arrived, they began riding in a gallop in a small circle, of which circle our little group, composed of a few officers and the chiefs, composed the center. The display of horsemanship was superb and made amends for the discordant sounds given forth as the music. During all times, reports continued to come in, leaving no room to doubt that the entire village was preparing to decamp. To have opposed this movement by a display of force of the part of the troops would have only precipitated a terrible conflict, from which I was not yet prepared, keeping in mind the rescue of the white girls. I did not propose, however, to relinquish the advantage we then had by our close proximity to the village and permit the latter to place several miles between us. Knowing that the musicians would soon depart, and with them perhaps the chiefs and warriors then grouped about my campfire, I determined to seize the principal chiefs then present, permit the village to depart if necessary, and hold the captive chiefs as hostages for the surrender of the white girls and the future good behavior of the tribe. This was a move requiring not only promptness but the most delicate and careful handling in order to avoid bloodshed. Quietly passing the word to a few of the officers who sat near me around the campfire, I directed them to leave the group one by one, and in such manner as not to attract the attention of the Indians, proceed to their companies and select quickly some of their most reliable men, instructing the latter to assemble around and near my campfire, well armed as if merely attracted there by the Indian serenade. The men thus selected were to come singly, appear to be unconcerned as possible, and be in readiness to act promptly, but to do nothing without orders from me. In this manner, about 100 of my men were, in an inconceivably short space of time, mingling with the Indians, who, to that number of 40 or more, sat or stood about my campfire, laughing in their sleeves. Had they not been minus these appendages, no doubt at the clever dodge by which they were entertaining the white men while their village was hastening preparations for a speedy flight. When the musicians had apparently exhausted their program, they took their departure, informing us that later in the evening they would return and repeat the performance. They might have added with an entire change of program. After their departure, the conversation continued with the chiefs until, by glancing about me, I saw that a significant number of my men had mingled with the Indians to answer my purpose. Of the 40 or more Indians in the group, there were but few chiefs, the majority being young men or boys. My attention was devoted to the chiefs, and acting upon the principle that for the purposes desired half a dozen would be as valuable as a half a hundred, I determined to seize the principal chiefs, then present and permit the others to depart. To do this without taking or losing life now became the problem. Indicating in a quiet manner to some of my men who were nearest to me to be ready to prevent the escape of 3 or 4 of the Indians whom I pointed out, I then directed Romeo to command silence on the part of the Indians and to inform them that I was about to communicate something of great importance to them. This was sufficient to attract their undivided attention. I then rose from my seat near the fire and, unbuckling my revolver from my waist, asked the Indians to observe that I threw my weapons upon the ground as an evidence that in what I was about to do I did not desire or propose to shed blood unless forced to do so. I then asked the chiefs to look about them and count the armed men who I had posted among and around them, completely cutting off every avenue of escape. They had attempted, under the pretense of a friendly visit to my camp, to deceive me, in order that their village might elude us, but their designs had been frustrated, and they were now in our power. I asked them to quietly submit to what was now inevitable, and promised them that if they and their people responded in the proper manner to the reasonable demands which I intended to make, all would be well, and they would be restored to their people. The reader must not imagine that this was listened to in tame silence by the thoroughly excited Indians, old and young. Upon the first intimation from me regarding the armed men, and before I could explain their purpose, every Indian who was dismounted sprang instantly to his feet, while those who were mounted gathered the reins of their ponies, all drew their revolvers or strung their bows, and for a few moments it seemed as if nothing could avert the collision, which could only terminate in the annihilation of the Indians and an equal or perhaps greater loss on our part. A single shot fired, an indiscreet word uttered, would have been the signal to commence. My men behaved admirably, taking their positions in such a manner that each Indian was confronted by at least 2 white men. All this time the Indians were gesticulating and talking in the most excited manner, the boys and young men counseling resistance, the older men and chiefs urging prudence until an understanding could be had. The powers of Romeo as an interpreter were employed without stint in repeating to the chiefs my urgent appeals to restrain their young men and avoid bloodshed. Even at this date I recall no more exciting experience with Indians than the occasion of which I now write. Near me stood a tall, gray-haired chief who, while entreating his people to be discreet, kept his cocked revolver in his hand ready for use should the emergency demand it. He was one of the few whom I had determined to hold. Near him stood another, a most powerful and forbidding-looking warrior who was without firearms, but who was armed with a bow already strung and a quiver full of iron-pointed arrows. His coolness during this scene of danger and excitement was often the subject of remark afterward between the officers whose attention had been drawn to him. He stood apparently unaffected by the excitement about him, but not unmindful of the surrounding danger. Holding his bow in one hand, with the other he continued to draw from his quiver arrow after arrow. Each one he would examine as coolly as if he expected to engage it in target practice. First he would cast his eye along the shaft of the arrow to see if it was perfectly straight and true. Then he would with thumb and finger gently feel the point of the edge of the barbed head, returning to the quiver each one whose condition did not satisfy him. In this manner he continued until he had selected perhaps half a dozen arrows with which he seemed satisfied and which he retained in his hand, while his quick eye did not permit a single incident about him to escape unnoticed. The noise of voices and the excitement increased until a movement began on the part of the Indians who were mounted, principally the young men and boys. If the latter could be allowed to escape and the chiefs be retained, the desired object would be gained. Suddenly a rush was made. But for the fact that my men were ordered not to fire, the attempt of the Indians would not have been successful. I, as well as the other officers near me, called upon the men not to fire. The result was that all but 4 broke through the lines and made their escape. The 4 detained, however, were those desired, being chiefs and warriors of prominence. Forming my men about them in such impassable ranks that a glance was sufficient to show how futile all further efforts to escape would prove, I then explained to the 4 captive Indians that I knew the design under which they had visited our camp, and I also knew that in their villages were held as captive 2 white girls, whose release the troops were there to enforce, and to effect their release, as well as to compel the Cheyennes to abandon the warpath and return to their reservation. I had seized the 4 Indians as hostages. To prove my sincerity and earnest desire to arrange these matters amicably and without resort to force, the Indians were told that they might select one of their number, whom I would release and send as a messenger of peace to the village, the latter having left in indiscriminate flight as soon as the seizure of the chiefs was made. It became a matter of great difficulty, without the employment of forces, to induce the 4 Indians to give up their arms. I explained to them that they were prisoners, and it was one of our customs to disarm all men held as prisoners. Should they be released, however, I assured them their arms would be restored to them. No argument could prevail upon them to relinquish their arms until I stated to them that a persistence in their refusal would compel me to summon a sufficient number of men to take the arms by force, and it was even necessary to parade the men in front of them before the arms were finally given up. After a lengthy conference with each other, they announced that they had agreed upon one of their number, who, in accordance with my promise, should be released and sent to the tribe as bearer of my demands, and of any messages they might desire to send to their people. I accordingly caused bountiful presents of coffee and sugar to be given to the one so chosen, returned to him his pony and arms, and entrusted him with verbal messages to his tribe, the substance of which was as follows. First, I demanded the unconditional surrender of the 2 white girls held captive in the village. Hitherto, surrenders of white captives by Indians had only been made on payment of heavy ransom. Second, I required the Cheyenne village, as an evidence of peaceable intentions and good faith on their part, to proceed at once to their reservation and to locate near Camp Supply, reporting to the military commander of that station. Third, I sent a friendly message to Little Robe, inviting him to visit me with a view to the speedy settlement of questions at issue, promising him unmolested transit, coming and returning for him as many of his people he chose to visit me. In case of failure to comply with the first 2 of my demands, hostilities would be continued, and my command would at once commence the pursuit of the village, which, considering its size and the poor condition of the ponies at that early season of the year, would be unable to escape from the cavalry. The Indian who was to go as bearer of these demands was also invited to return, assured that whether the response of his people should prove favorable or not, he should be granted a safe conduct between the camp and village. Inwardly congratulating himself, no doubt, upon the good fortune which gave him his liberty, The messenger of peace or war, as his tribe might elect, took his departure for his village. With him went the earnest wishes for success of every inmate of the camp. But if this was a feeling of the command generally, who can realize the intense interest and anxiety with which young Brewster now awaited the result of this effort to secure the freedom of his sister? And if the two forlorn, helpless girls knew of the presence of troops of their own race, what must have been the bitter despondency, the painful relinquishment of all hopes as they saw the village and its occupants commencing a hasty flight, and no apparent effort upon the part of the troops to effect their release? What comfort it would have been to these ill-fated maidens could they have known, before being hurried from the village, of the steps already taken to restore them to home and friends, or better still, if one of them could have known that almost within the sound of her voice a brother was patiently but determinedly biding the time that should restore his sister to his arms. Relying on the influence which I believe Little Robe would exert upon his people, and knowing the pressure we were able to bring to bear through the three chiefs who were held hostage, I felt confident that sooner or later the Cheyennes would be forced to release the two white girls from their captivity. Placing a strong guard over the three chiefs and warning them not to attempt to escape if they valued their lives, I returned to my tent after having ordered every comfort possible to be provided for our prisoners consistent with their position. It was perhaps an hour or more after dark when an Indian voice was heard calling from one of the hillocks overlooking the camp. End of chapter 20, part 3. Chapter 20, Part 4 of My Life on the Plains. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I proceeded to the guard fire, which the three chiefs were still seated, engaged in conversation, and through Romeo inquired who the parties were whose voices we heard, and their object. They informed me that the voices were those of some of their young men who were anxious to ascertain if their friends, the captives, were still alive, anxious that they should not only see that their friends were alive, but well treated. I desired to induce them to come within our lines and visit the captive chiefs. This was communicated to them through the chiefs, who called them in tones capable of being heard far beyond the point at which the young Indians were posted. But this did not satisfy their suspicious natures. They imagined some trap and declined to accept the invitation. Romeo, the only one who could converse freely in the Indian tongue, might have been able to persuade them to come in, but it was not safe for him to venture beyond the line of our pickets and trust himself in the power of the young Indians. In this emergency I thought of Monacita, in whom I had every confidence and who I believed might be successful in inducing her friends to come in. Sending for her, I soon acquainted her with my plan, to which she gave her ready assent, only expressing an apprehension that, in passing our own chain of sentries in the darkness, they might mistake her for an enemy and fire upon her. This difficulty I removed by offering to escort her safely through the line of pickets and there await her return. Starting at once in the darkness, she clinging to my hand with the natural timidity of a girl, we proceeded to the picket station nearest to the point from which the sound of the voices had come, and after explaining to the sentry our purpose, passed beyond as far as it was prudent to do, and then, bidding Monacita to proceed on her mission, I halted to await her return. A few moments later I heard her voice in the darkness calling to her friends beyond. Back came the quick response, and soon I could distinguish the tones of the assembled group as Monacita endeavored to convince them of their security in trusting to the promises made to them. Her arguments finally prevailed over their suspicions, and in the dim light of the stars I could see her returning, accompanied by 4 or 5 others. Not caring to tempt them by meeting them alone so far from support, I slowly retired until I was near the picket post. Here the Indians found me, and after the form of an introduction by Monacita and a general handshaking, the entire party proceeded without hesitation to the guard fire, where they joined their less fortunate chiefs. It may strike the reader with some surprise that Monacita herself, a captive in our hands, should have voluntarily returned to us that night, after once being safely beyond our lines. But she only confirmed the confidence that was placed in her. During her imprisonment, if her stay in our camp without a guard may be termed imprisonment, she had become a great favorite with the entire command. Not only this, but she believed she would in due time be given up to her own people, and that until then she would receive kind treatment at our hands and be exposed to less personal danger and suffering during hostilities than if with her village. The visit of the young men to our camp that night could not but have had a beneficial influence upon the tribe, as they were enabled to see that the three chiefs were being treated with the utmost consideration, and were being held as informed at first, simply as hostages, to enforce compliance with demands, which even in Indian ideas of right and wrong must pronounce just. After a lengthy conversation between the captives and their friends, the latter took their departure, charged with messages to their village, both from the captive chiefs and me, similar to those transmitted through the chief who had been released for that purpose. The following day was passed without incident in awaiting the arrival of tidings from the village. Early in the afternoon, the pickets reported a small body of Indians in sight. Upon a nearer approach, the party appeared to consist of about 50 mounted Indians. They rode steadily in the direction of the camp with no apparent wish to conceal their movements, thus indicating that they were on an errand of peace. When within a half a mile or less of camp, the entire party dismounted, and after picketing their ponies out to graze, advanced on foot directly toward the camp. So strange a proceeding at a time when the excitement regarding our relations with the Indians ran high, was sufficient to assemble nearly all the occupants of camp to watch the approach of this delegation of Indians. The latter were apparelled in their best and most highly colored clothes. As they came near, it was perceived that several paces in advance of the main group strode two chiefs, evidently leaders of the party. Both advanced with uncovered heads. Suddenly, I thought I detected a familiar face and form in the taller of the two chiefs in front, and on more careful scrutiny I recognized my former friend and guest, Little Robe, who had thus quickly responded to my invitation to cast aside all doubts and come and visit me, with a view to bringing about more friendly relations between his people and the whites. As soon as I recognized him, I advanced to meet him. He grasped my hand and embraced me with what seemed to be real cordiality. Waiting until the other members of his party came up, I shook hands with each individual, and then invited them to my tent. As the tent would not accommodate the entire party, Little Robe designated about a dozen of the most important, who entered while the others remained outside. I soon found that in Little Robe I had a hearty coadjutor in the work before me. He admitted that the white girls were held as captives in the Cheyenne village, which was the first positive evidence received of this fact. He also stated, what I had no reason to doubt, that he had at various times attempted to purchase them, with a view, if successful, of returning them to the nearest military post. But his efforts in this direction had always failed. He admitted the justice of my demands upon his people, and assured me that to bring about a satisfactory condition of affairs, he would use every exertion and employ all of the influence at his command. It was to assure me of this desire on his part that he had hastened to visit me, knowing that the surest and speediest way to establish a state of good feeling in an Indian is to provide liberally for the wants of his stomach. I ordered a beef to be killed and distributed among the followers of Little Robe, With this also were distributed the usual supplies of coffee, sugar, flour, etc., so that their recipients were not only prepared to regard us as at least very kindly disposed, but I knew the effect on the village when the result of the visit and the treatment extended to our guests was described would materially aid us in our negotiations with the tribe. Little Robe, while earnest in his desire to see the white girls return to us, frankly admitted that his influence was not supreme, and there were those who would object to their release, at least without compensation, and it might be that a satisfactory settlement of the question might be delayed for many days. After partaking in a bountiful repast, Little Robe and his party set out for the village, promising to send me word the following day as to his success. Another day was passed in waiting, when the chief who had accompanied Little Robe the previous day again visited us, but brought no decisive or satisfactory reply. The substance of the reply was that the Cheyenne desired us to release the 3 chiefs then held by us as hostages, after which they would be prepared to consider the question of the release of the 2 white girls. To this I sent back a reply that we would remain in the camp we then occupied until the following day, when, if a favorable answer should not be received, we would follow on their trail and encamp nearer to the village, the great distance then separating us, about 12 miles, being a hindrance in the way of transmitting messages promptly from one to the other. I knew that the village was in no condition for a rapid or extended flight, and could be overhauled by the cavalry whenever desired. At the same time, to allow as much freedom to their deliberations as possible, I had not been unwilling that a few miles should separate us. No reply was received. Consequently, we packed up and marched down the Sweetwater on their trail of the village, about 10 miles, and went into camp. Here I received another visit from the chief who had previously acted as diplomatic courier between the camp and village, but the response of the Cheyennes was still unsatisfactory, and exhibited a disinclination on their part to make any decided promises respecting the release of the captive white girls. They insisted as preliminary to such decision that the 3 chiefs held by us should be restored to liberty, after which we might discuss the question relating to the release of the girls. I will not weary the reader by describing the various subterfuges resorted to by the Indians, by which they strove to avoid or delay the surrender of the white girls, without first, as has been customary, receiving a ransom. Finally, after I had almost exhausted the patience of the troops, particularly of the Kansas regiment, which had been raised and organized mainly to effect the recapture of the white girls, or else avenge the outrage of which they had been the victims, I determined to force matters to an issue without further quibbling on the part of the Indians. I sent for a delegation of chiefs from the Cheyenne village to receive my ultimatum. They came, and upon their arrival I assembled them in my tent, the 3 captive chiefs being also permitted to be present, as the conference, as will be seen, was to be of deep interest to them. After recounting to the chiefs the incidents of our pursuit of the village, their surprise at being overtaken, the stratagems by which they hoped to elude us, the steps which we had already taken to obtain the release of the white girls, and the delays imposed by the Indians, I stated that I had but one other message to be sent to the village, and upon the chiefs of the latter would rest the responsibility of the peace or war. Further delay would not be submitted to on our part. We knew they had 2 of our race captives in the village, and we were there to demand and enforce the demand for their release, cost what it might. I then informed them that if by sunset the following day the 2 white girls were not restored to our hands unharmed, the lives of the 3 chiefs would be forfeited, and the troops would resume active hostilities. At the same time, I called attention to the fact that in the famished condition of their ponies, they could not expect to escape the pursuit of the cavalry. Every argument which might have weighed in influencing a favorable decision was stated to them. The conference then broke up, and the 3 chiefs were remanded to the custody of the guard. The delegation from the village, after a brief interview with their captive comrades, took a hasty departure and set out upon their return to the village, deeply impressed apparently with the importance of promptness in communicating to the chiefs at the village the decision which had been arrived at regarding the captives. The terms given to the Indians soon became known to every individual in the command, and naturally excited the deepest interest. All hoped for a favorable issue, but no one regarded the events then transpiring with the intense interest and anxiety felt by young Brewster, who now saw that his long-cherished hope to recover his sister was either about to be realized or forever sealed in disappointment. The captive chiefs did not pretend to conceal their solicitude as to the part they were involuntarily made to play in the events then transpiring. I did not expect prompt action on the part of the chiefs in the village. I knew they would practice every delay conceivable before complying with our demands, but when the question was forced upon them as to whether they preferred to deliver up the white girls to us, or to force by their refusal the execution of the three chiefs, their decision would be in favor of their people. 3 o'clock arrived, and no tidings from the village. By this time the officers and men of the command had assembled near headquarters and upon the small eminences nearby, eagerly watching the horizon in the direction of the village to catch the first glimpse of the messengers who must soon arrive to avert the execution of the three chiefs. Even the three chiefs became despondent as the sun slowly but surely approached the horizon, with no tidings from the village reaching them. Finally, Romeo came to me and stated that one of the three chiefs desired to see me. I repaired to their place of confinement at once and was asked by the younger of the three if it was my firm purpose to make good my words in the event of the failure of their people to release the white girls. I replied in the affirmative. The chief then attempted a little Indian diplomacy by assuring me that in the village and among his own people he was a man of great consequence and could exert a wide influence. For this reason, he requested me to release him and would hasten to the village, obtain the release of the two girls, and return in time to save his two companions. When this proposition was first made, I attributed it to the fear that the chiefs in the village might decline to restore the two girls to liberty, and the lives of the three chiefs would be sacrificed thereby. But subsequent events proved that while this consideration may have had its influence, which prompted the proposition was a desire to escape from our hands before the white girls should be restored to us, as the chief referred to had been a party to their capture and to the subsequent ill treatment they had received. I replied to his proposal that if he was such of an importance in his tribe as he claimed to be, he was the most proper person for me to retain possession of, as his people would be more likely to accede to my demands to save his life than that of a person of less consequence. The sun was perhaps an hour high when the dim outlines of about 20 mounted figures were discerned against the horizon on a hill high 2 or 3 miles to the west of us. Instantly all eyes were directed to the party, but the distance was too great to enable any of us to clearly define either the number of characters of the group. The eyes of the three chiefs perceptibly brightened with hope. Securing my field glass, I carefully scanned the party on the hill. Every one about me waited in anxious suspense to the result of my examination. Gradually, under the magnifying powers of the glass, I was able to make out the figures in sight. I could only determine at first that the group was, as might be imagined, composed of Indians, and began counting them audibly, when I discovered 2 figures mounted on the same pony. As soon as this was announced, several of my companions at once exclaimed, "Can they be the girls?" I could detect nothing, however, in their appearance warranting such a conclusion, their dress apparently being the same as that of other individuals of the group. While endeavoring to make out something more definite in regards to the party, I saw the two figures descend from the pony and, leaving the rest of the group, advance towards us on foot. All this I reported to the anxious bystanders, who became now more than ever convinced that the two figures approaching must be the two girls. I began describing the appearance of the two as well as I could with the aid of the glass. One seems to have a short, heavy figure. The other is considerably taller and more slender. Young Brewster, who stood at my side, immediately responded, "That last one must be my sister. She is quite tall. Let me go and meet them. This anxiety is more than I can endure." But this I declined, fearing that should one of the two now approaching us prove to be a sister, seeing her in the forlorn condition in which she must be might provoke young Brewster beyond control, and induce him to attempt to obtain revenge in a manner not governed by either prudence or propriety. So I reluctantly declined to permit him to advance beyond our lines. But by this time the two figures had approached near enough to enable me clearly to determine that they were really of white complexion, and undoubtedly the two girls whose release we were so impatiently waiting for. As the Kansas volunteers had left their homes and various occupations in civil life to accomplish, among other results, the release of the two girls who had been abducted from their frontier of their state, I deemed it appropriate that regiment should be the first to welcome the two released captives to friends and freedom. Accordingly, the three senior officers of the regiment were designated to proceed beyond our lines and conduct the two girls to camp, a duty whose performance carried its pleasure with it. The three officers advanced to meet the two figures. I use the term figures as the dress was that nondescript pattern which renders this term most appropriate. They had passed 1/4 of the distance, perhaps, when young Brewster, whom I had detained at my side with difficulty, bounded away, and the next moment was running at full speed to greet his long-lost sister. Dashing past three officers, he clasped in his arms the taller of the two girls. This told us all we had hoped for. We awaited their approach, and as they drew nearer to the little brook which flowed just beyond the point occupied by the group of officers around me, I stepped forward, and extending my hands to the two girls, bade them a hearty welcome to liberty. In a moment, officers and men were struggling about them upon all sides, eager to take them by the hand and testify the great joy felt at their deliverance from a life of captivity. Men whom I had seen face death without quailing found their eyes filled with tears, unable to restrain the deep emotion produced by this joyful event. The appearance of the two girls was sufficient to excite our deepest sympathy. Miss White, the younger of the two, though not beautiful, possessed a most interesting face. Her companion would have been pronounced beautiful by the most critical judge, being of such a type as one might imagine Maud Muller to be. Their joy at the deliverance, however, could not hide the evidences of privation and suffering to which they had been subjected by their cruel captors. They were clothed in dresses made from flour sacks, the brand of the mills being plainly seen on each dress, showing that the Indians who had held them in captivity had obtained their provisions from the government at some agency. The entire dress of the two girls was as nearly like the Indian mode as possible. Both wore leggings and moccasins. Both wore their hair in two long braids as if to propitiate us. The Indians, before releasing them, had added to the wardrobe of the two various rude ornaments such as are worn by squaws. About their wrists they wore coils of brass wire. On their fingers had been placed numerous rings, and about their necks strings of variously colored beads. Among the first remark I heard young Brewster make after the arrival of the two girls was, "Sister, take those hateful things off." Fortunately, they were not the only white women in camp. I had a white woman as a cook, and to enable the two girls to improve their wardrobe a little before relating to us the history of their capture and captivity, they were conducted to the tent of the white woman referred to, from whose limited wardrobe they were able to obtain enough to replace the dresses made of flour sacks and in a few minutes reappeared, presenting a much more civilized appearance than when they first entered camp. In a previous chapter I have given the main incidents of their capture. The story of their captivity was that of 100 other women and girls whose husbands, fathers, or brothers take their lives in their hands and seek homes on the frontier. There was much in their story not appropriate for these pages. They described how great their joy was at encountering each other from the first time as prisoners in the hands of the Indians. They had been traded repeatedly from the hands of one chief to those of another, the last transfer having been effected only 2 weeks prior to their release. Soon after their first meeting, it was their good fortune, comparatively, to become the property of one chief. This threw them into each other's society and tended to lighten the horrors of their captivity. While thrown together in this manner, they planned an escape. Their plan, it seems, was more the result of desperation than of careful deliberation, as they had no idea as to what state or territory the village was then in, nor in what direction to travel should they escape from the village. Indeed, one of their first questions on entering our line was to ask in what part of the country we were in. Determining all hazards, however, to flee from their captives as the first opportunity and trust to chance to lead them to the settlements or to some military post, they escaped from the village one night and traveled for several hours in a northerly direction. During this attempt to regain their liberty, they reached a wagon road over which wagons and horses had passed recently, and were congratulating themselves upon the success of their effort when a bullet whistled past them and in close proximity to them. Casting an anxious look, they saw, to their horror and disappointment, their late captor or owner riding at full speed in pursuit. Escape was impossible. Nothing remained but to await the arrival of the chief, who came up excited and in savage rage at the idea of their attempt to escape him. Marching back on foot to the village, they became the recipients of renewed insults and taunts. Nor did it end there. The squaws of the village, always jealous of white women when captives, took this opportunity to treat them with the greatest severity for their attempt to regain their liberty. The old chief also decided upon a change of program. He had invested several ponies when he had become the possessor of the two girls, and he did not propose to risk the loss of this property. So he determined to separate the two girls by selling one of them, and the two friends in misfortune were torn from each other. Miss White, in consideration of the 3 ponies given in exchange, passed into the hands of another chief, whose lodge was generally located some miles from that of her late master. The story of the two girls, containing accounts of wrongs and ill treatment sufficient to have ended their existence of less determined persons, is too long to be given here. Besides indignities and insults far more terrible than the death itself, the physical suffering to which the two girls were subjected was too great almost to be believed. They were required to transport huge burdens on their backs, large enough to have made a load for a beast of burden. They were limited to barely enough food to sustain life, sometimes a small morsel of mule meat. Not more than an inch square was their allowance of food for 24 hours. The squaws beat upon them unmercifully with clubs whenever the men were not present. Upon one occasion, one of the girls was felled to the ground by a blow from a club in the hands of one of the squaws. Their joy, therefore, at regaining their freedom after the captivity of nearly a year can be better imagined than described, while that of the brother, who had struggled so long and determinately to regain his sister, could not be expressed in words. After the momentary excitement consequent upon the safe arrival of the girls in camp had subsided, officers, particularly of the Kansas volunteers, came to me with the remark that when we first overtook the Cheyenne village and I failed to order an attack when all the chances were in our favor, they mentally condemned my decision as a mistake, but with the results accomplished afterwards they found ample reason to amend their first judgment. and frankly and cordially admit that the release of the two captives was far more gratifying than any victory over the Indians could have been if purchased by the sacrifice of their lives. With this happy termination of this much of our negotiations with the Indians, I determined to march in the morning for Camp Supply, Indian Territory, satisfied that with the 3 chiefs in our possession and the squaws and children captured at the Washita still held as prisoners at Fort Hays, Kansas, we could compel the Cheyennes to abandon the warpath and return to their reservation. The 3 chiefs begged to be released upon the grounds that their people had delivered up the 2 girls, but this I told them was but one of the 2 conditions imposed. The other required the tribe to return to the reservation, and until this was done, they need not hope for freedom. But in the meanwhile, I assured them of kind treatment at our hands. Before dark, a delegation of chiefs from the village visited the camp to likewise urge the release of the 3 chiefs. My reply to them was the same as that I had given to the captives. I assured them, however, that upon complying with their treaty obligations and returning to their reservation, the 3 chiefs would be restored to their people, and we would return to them also the women and children captured at the Washita. Seeing that no modification of these terms could be obtained, they finally promised to accede to them, saying that their ponies, as I knew to be the fact, were in no condition to travel. But as soon as practicable, they would surely proceed with their entire village to Camp Supply and abandon the warpath forever, a promise which, as a tribe, they have adhered to from that day to this with strict faith, so far as my knowledge extends. I had not heard from General Sheridan since we separated at Fort Sill. He too set out for Camp Supply, and I with my command to begin my present movement. But when near Camp Supply, a courier met me with dispatches from General Sheridan, who had been meanwhile summoned to Washington, informing me in regard to the arrangements made for my command upon its arrival at Camp Supply. The Kansas volunteers were to march to Fort Hays and there be mustered out of service. The 7th Cavalry was also to proceed to the same point and there await further orders, as the general in his note stated that he had concluded to draw in the 7th and end the campaign. In reply to my letters written subsequently from Camp Supply giving him a detailed account of our operations, including the release of the 2 white girls, I received a letter of warm encouragement from the general written from Chicago, where he had just established his present headquarters. In that letter he wrote, "I am very much rejoiced at the success of your expedition, and feel proud of our winter's operation and of the officers and men who have borne its privations and hardships so manfully. Give my kind regards to the officers, and say how happy I should be to see them should any of them come this way on leave." These words of hearty sympathy and approval from one who had not only shared but appreciated at their true worth our privations and hardships were far more cheering and valued than the empty honor contained in a half a dozen brevets bestowed grudgingly and recalled in a moment of pique. Making a brief halt at Camp Supply to rest our animals and replenish our stores, my command continued its march to Fort Hays, crossing the Arkansas River at Fort Dodge, Kansas. Upon our arrival at Fort Hays, we were met by the husband of the young Brewster's sister, who had learned of her restoration to liberty from the published dispatches which had preceded us to Fort Hays. He was still lame from the effects of the bullet wound received at the time the Indians carried off his bride, whom he had given up as dead or lost to him forever. The joy of their meeting went far to smooth over their late sorrow. They could not find languages to express their gratitude to the troops for their efforts in restoring them to each other. As the Indians had robbed them of everything at the time of the attack, a collection was taken up among the troops for their benefit, which resulted in the accumulation of several $100s to be divided between the 2 captives. The time came for our guests to leave us and rejoin their people, or such of them as had survived the attack of the Indians. Goodbyes were spoken, and the two girls, so lately victims of the most heartless and cruel captivity, departed with husband, brother, and friends for their frontier homes, bearing with them the warm sympathies and cordial good wishes of every soldier in the command. Montecita was anxious to visit her friends who were now captives at Fort Hays, and who were kept in a large stockade at the post, our camp being placed some 2 or 3 miles below the post. Accordingly, she repaired to the stockade and spent several hours relating, no doubt, the story of our march since they had separated from each other. She preferred to live in the cavalry camp when she was allowed to roam without the restraint of a guard, but it was deemed advisable soon after to place her with the other women and children inside the stockade. The 3 captive chiefs were also transferred to the same place for safekeeping. Here a most unfortunate misunderstanding arose. The chiefs had been confined inside the same enclosure with the women and children, but in separate tents. The commanding officer of the post decided to remove them to rooms in the guardhouse adjoining the stockade. This was decided upon as a measure of security. There was no interpreter kept at the post. Consequently, there was no way of communicating with the Indians except by rude signs, and even this method was but indifferently understood by the infantry soldiers constituting the garrison of the post. From accounts given to me by the Indians afterwards, it seems the men of the guard, in the execution of the order to transfer the 3 chiefs, entered the stockade muskets in hand, and upon the failure of the chiefs to comprehend what was required of them, the soldiers attempted to push the chiefs from the stockade by force, pointing with their bayonets to the outside. The chiefs, failing to understand a word spoken to them, and with a natural suspicion of their race, imagined that they were being led or driven forth to execution, and determined to die there and then. An attack was at once made upon the guard with knives which they had carried beneath their blankets. The sergeant of the guard received a stab in the back which almost proved mortal. This was a signal for a determined fight between the 3 chiefs and the guard, the latter having the decided advantage in numbers and weapons. The result could not be long doubtful. One of the chiefs, Big Head, the young man who had proposed to proceed to the village to obtain the release of the 2 white girls, fell dead at the first fire of the guard. The oldest of the 3, Dull Knife, received a bayonet wound through the body which proved fatal in a few days. The 3rd, Fat Bear, was felled by a blow from a butt of a musket, but did not receive serious injury. Knowing that I could converse with the Indians, and from my acquaintance with them might be able to quiet the excitement among the remaining prisoners, the commanding officer of the post sent for me for assistance. Upon repairing to the stockade, I found the women and children in a state of great excitement and huddled together inside their tents. Entering the stockade, I soon learned their version of the affair, which did not vary materially from that just given. Montecita pointed to a bullet hole in her blanket, the effect of a stray shot fired during the melee. The affair was a source of deep regret to all. The Cheyennes, in accordance with their promises made to me, returned to their reservation, and having thus far complied with the terms of the agreement then made, it devolved upon the military authorities to return to them their people whom we had, up to that time and since the Battle of the Washita, retained as prisoners of war. An order was accordingly issued releasing the only surviving chief, Fat Bear, and the women and children that were held at Fort Hays. Wagons and subsistence were furnished them from Fort Hays to Camp Supply, and a squadron of the 7th Cavalry escorted them to the latter point, where they were received by their own people. Montecita, although gladdened by the prospect of being restored to her people, exhibited marked feelings of regret when the time for her departure arrived. She had grown quite accustomed to the easy, idle life she had led among the troops, as compared with the mere existence of toil and drudgery to which all tribes of Indians consign their squaws. Romeo, who had accompanied us throughout the events described in these pages as the interpreter, took unto himself a wife from the Cheyenne village, and thereafter became a sort of trader between the whites and Indians. I believe he is still acting in that capacity. Lone Wolf is still the leading chief of the Kiowas, but if public and private advices are to be relied upon, he has acted with extremely bad faith toward the government, and even as these lines are being penned, is reported as absent from his reservation, leading a war party of his people in committing depredations upon the people of the Texas frontier. Satanta, since his release from the Texas State Prison, has led a comparatively quiet and uneventful life. How much of this is due to his incarceration in prison for a short term of years can only be inferred. Little Raven continues to exercise the powers of head chief of the Arapahoes, although he is too old to infirm to exercise active command. My former friend and companion, Yellow Bear, is the second chief in rank to Little Raven, and probably will succeed to the dignities of the later ere many years have rolled around. Little Robe of the Cheyennes, whose acts and words were always on the side of peace, died some 3 years ago. A few words in regard to one other character with whom the reader of these sketches has been made acquainted, and I shall have disposed of the principal personages not included in the military, whom the reader has encountered from time to time. California Joe accompanied my command to Fort Hays, Kansas, on the Kansas Pacific Railroad, when the troops were partially disbanded and sent to different stations. California Joe had never seen a railroad nor a locomotive, and here determined to improve his first opportunity in these respects and to take a trip in the cars to Leavenworth, distant about 400 miles. A few days afterward, an officer of my command happened to be called to Leavenworth, thought he recognized a familiar form and face in front of the leading hotel of the city. A closer scrutiny showed that the party recognized was none other than California Joe. But how changed! Under the manipulations of the barber and through the aid of the proprietor of a gentleman's furnishing store, the long curly locks and beard of California Joe, both of which had avoided contact with comb, brush, or razor for many years, had undergone a complete metamorphosis. His hair and beard were neatly trimmed and combed, while his figure, a very commanding one, had discarded the rough shirt of the frontiersman and had now adorned by the latest efforts of fashion. If the reader imagines, however, that these changes were in keeping with the taste of California Joe by impression, is wholly incorrect. He had effected them simply for a sensation. The following day he took the cars for the West, satisfied with the faint glimpse of civilization he had had. As I soon after left that portion of the plains in which these scenes are laid, I saw no more of California Joe, but I often wondered what had become of my loquacious friend, whose droll sayings and quaint remarks had often served to relieve the tedium of the march and to enliven the group about the campfire. I had begun, after a few years has passed without trace or tidings from Joe, to fear that he had perhaps gone to the happy hunting ground, to which he no doubt had sent more than one dusky enemy, when a few weeks ago I was most agreeably surprised to receive indubitable evidence that California Joe was still in the land of the living, but exactly where I could not determine, as his letter was simply dated Sierra Nevada Mountains, California. Now, as this range of mountains extends through the entire length and embraces a considerable portion of the state of California, Joe's address could not be definitely determined. But as his letter is so characteristic of the man, I here introduce it as the valedictory of California Joe. Sierra Nevada Mountains, California, March 16, 1874. Dear General, after my respects to you and lady, I thought that I'd tell you that I am still on top of land, yet I have been in the Rocky Mountains the most of the time since I last seen you. But I got on the railroad and started west, and the first thing I knew I landed in San Francisco, so I could not go any further except going by water, and salt water at that. So I turned back and headed for the mountains once more, resolved never to go railroading no more. I drifted up with the tide to Sacramento City, and I landed my boat. So I took up through town, and They say there's 20,000 people living there, but it looked to me more like 100,000, counting Chinamen, and all I can't describe my wolfish feeling, but I think that I looked just like I did when we was chasing buffalo on the Cimarron. So I struck up through town, and I come to a large, fine building crowded with people, so I bulged in to see what was going on, and when I got into the council house, I took a look around at the crowd, and I see the most of them had bald heads. So I thought to myself, I stuck it now that they are Indian peace commissioners. So I looked to see if I would knew any of them, but not one. So after a while, the smartest-looking one got up and said, "Gentlemen, I introduce a bill to have speckled mountain trout and fish eggs imported to California to be put in the American Bear and Yuba rivers. Those rivers is so muddy that a tadpole could not live in them caused by mining. Did anybody ever hear of a speckled trout living in muddy water?" And the next thing was the game law, and that was very near as bad as the fish, for there ain't no game in the country as big as mockingbird. And I heard some fellow behind me ask how long is the legislators been in session. Then I dropped on myself it wasn't Indian commissioners after all. So I slid out and took across to Chinatown, and they smelled like a Kiowa camp in August with plenty buffalo meat around. It was getting late, so no place to go, not got a red cent. So I happened to think of an old friend back at town, and I'd known 25 years ago. So I lit out, and sure enough, he was there, just as I left him 25 years ago, batching. So I got a few seeds I'm going to plant in a few days, give my respects to the 7th Cavalry, and accept the same yorsely. California Joe. The events described in this chapter terminated my service in the field on what is known as the Southern and Middle Plains, embracing all that portion of the plains south of the Platte River. From and after the Washita campaign, the frontiers of Kansas have enjoyed comparative peace and immunity from Indian depredations. No general Indian war has prevailed in that part of the country, nor is it probable that anything more serious in this way than occasional acts of horse stealing will occur hereafter. Many of my friends have expressed surprise that I have not included in Life on the Plains some of the hunting scenes and adventures which had formed a part of my experience, but I feared the introduction of this new feature, although probably the pleasantest and in many respects the most interesting of my recollections of border life, might prolong the series of articles far beyond the length originally assigned to them. I hope, however, at an early day to relate some of the experiences with the large game so abundant on the plains, and in this way fill up the blank in these articles which my friends, who are lovers of the sport, have not failed to observe. As I pen these lines, I am in the midst of scenes of bustle and busy preparation, attendant upon the organization and equipment of a large party for an important exploring expedition, on which I shall start before these pages reach the publisher's hands. During my absence, I expect to visit a region of the country as yet unseen by human eyes except those of the Indian, a country described by the latter as abounding in game of all varieties, rich in scientific interest, and of surpassing beauty and natural scenery. Bidding adieu to civilization for the next few months, I also now take leave of my readers, who I trust, in accompanying me through my retrospect, have been enabled to gain a true insight into a cavalryman's life on the plains. The end. End of Chapter 20, Part 4. End of My Life on the Plains, or Personal Experiences with Indians, by George A. Custer. This has been a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. If you'd like more information or how to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.